The smell hit her first. Copper and rain, the particular kind of wet that soaks into brick and never fully leaves. The smell of a city that has seen too much and forgiven too little. Zuri Mensah was cutting through Callaway Lane at 11:47 on a Thursday night because her shift at Mercy General had run 4 hours over. Her feet were screaming inside her compression socks, and the 9B bus stopped running at 11. She knew better than to walk through Callaway Lane at night. Every woman who had grown up in this part of Dellwick City knew better, but knowing better and having options were two entirely different luxuries, and Zuri had long since learned which one she could actually afford. She had her keys threaded between her fingers. Her earphones were in but no music was playing. She kept them in so men wouldn't talk to her, a small deception that cost nothing. Her eyes moved the way her mother had taught her, not darting, not nervous, just steady, aware, the way a woman learns to walk through a world that was not entirely built with her safety in mind. She almost walked past them. The dumpster at the far end of the lane was overflowing. It always was, and the shadow it threw against the wall was long and shapeless. She wouldn't have looked twice except that the shadow moved. Not the way shadows move when the wind shifts or a cat knocks over a bottle. It moved with weight, with intent, with the particular violence of a fist meeting a ribcage. Zuri stopped. There were two of them, both in dark clothing, both wearing the kind of plain black masks that suggested this wasn't impulsive. It was planned. They were working with efficiency, not rage. That distinction would only matter to her later. What mattered now was the third man on the ground, one hand braced against the wet asphalt, the other raised in a gesture so instinctive and so useless it made something in her chest tighten against her will. She should have kept walking. Every single reasonable voice inside her said the same thing in the same tone. The voice of her mother, her older sister Adizke, her nursing school professor who had once told the class that a dead hero helps no one. Keep walking, Zuri. This is not yours. You are tired and alone, and you have work again in 9 hours, and whatever is happening in that alley between those men is a world that will swallow you without blinking. She stood there for 4 full seconds. Then the man on the ground made a sound. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't even a cry. It was smaller than that, a sharp, involuntary exhale, the kind a body makes when pain arrives faster than the mind can process it. The kind of sound that bypasses all rational thought and lands directly in the part of a person that was formed before language. Zuri had heard that sound in the emergency ward. She had heard it from a 7-year-old with a broken arm and a 63-year-old who'd had a cardiac episode while shoveling his driveway. She had heard it from people whose bodies were telling them, quietly and without theater, that something had gone seriously wrong. Her feet moved before she decided to move them. Hey, her voice came out louder than she expected. It cracked the silence of the lane like a stone through glass. Hey, I'm calling the police right now. She wasn't. Her phone was in her bag, and her hands were still fisted around her keys. But she said it the way her mother had taught her to say everything important, like she meant it completely. The two masked men looked up. For a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, which felt considerably longer than they had any right to. Nobody moved. Zuri held their gaze through the dark. Her heart was doing something architectural inside her chest, building itself into a structure she didn't recognize, all height and no support. But her face stayed even. She had a face made for staying even under pressure. Her colleagues at the hospital called it her code face. She'd never told them she'd had it long before nursing school. The taller of the two men tilted his head, just slightly, like he was recalibrating. Then both of them walked, not ran, walked to the far end of the lane and disappeared around the corner. Zuri exhaled. Then she walked toward the man on the ground, because of course she did, because she was who she was, because some people are built by their histories into shapes that make walking away from a bleeding stranger functionally impossible. She crouched down beside him. Up close, the first thing she registered was the suit. Even torn, even with the left sleeve half separated from the shoulder seam, it was extraordinary, the kind of fabric that had a relationship with light, that caught it and held it and gave it back differently. She had grown up in a house where suits like that existed only on television. Her brain catalogued it automatically, bespoke, Italian probably, worth more than 3 months of her salary. The second thing she registered was his face. He was somewhere in his late 30s. Sharp features, the kind that photographs well and intimidates in person. A jaw that looked like it had been constructed with some specific purpose in mind. Dark hair, disheveled now, falling across a forehead that was bleeding from a cut just above the left temple. His eyes, when they found hers, were an unusual color, not quite grey, not quite green, the shade of the ocean in October when the summer light has finally given up. They were also unmistakably furious. Not frightened, not grateful, furious. "Don't," he said. His voice was low and precise despite everything. "Don't touch me." Zuri looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the gash on his temple, the way his right hand was pressed against his ribs, the slight wrongness in the angle of his left shoulder. "That's a lovely sentiment," she said, and opened her bag for her first aid kit, because she was a nurse and she carried one everywhere, and because the arrogance of an injured man telling her not to help him was, at this particular moment, so fascinatingly audacious that she almost wanted to study it. Have you ever helped someone who didn't want to be helped, and been glad you did anyway? Tell us below. His name, she would learn over the following 20 minutes of him resisting, and her ignoring the resistance, was Caspian Voss. Not that he told her willingly. He told her the way people who are accustomed to controlling information release it when cornered in pieces, each one offered with the weight of a concession. First his name. Then, when she asked if he had any known allergies before she cleaned the temple wound, a clipped no. Then, when she noted the rib tenderness and asked if he could breathe without sharp pain, a pause so telling it functioned as its own answer. "Breathe in slowly," she told him. "I know how to breathe." Clearly not well enough to avoid getting beaten up in an alley. The silence that followed was the sharpest silence she had experienced in recent memory. She kept her eyes on her work, pressing a gauze pad to the temple wound, with the practiced steadiness of someone who had done this in worse conditions, with worse lighting, and far less cooperation. Caspian Voss did not respond to that. Which, she would later think, was the first interesting thing about him. She had expected either anger or embarrassment. Most men, when disarmed by an accurate observation, went one of those two ways. He went neither. He simply went quiet in a way that suggested he was doing something with the comment, filing it maybe, examining it, the way you examine something you weren't expecting to find. "You need an X-ray," she said. "The ribs feel intact, but I can't confirm without imaging. Your shoulder was dislocated and I've reset it, which I realize you're going to pretend didn't hurt." "It didn't. And the temple laceration needs 2 stitches, minimum. You should go to a hospital." "I'm not going to a hospital." She sat back on her heels and looked at him properly for the first time since she'd started working. He had pulled himself up against the alley wall, his posture still carrying the ghost of whatever it looked like when it was fully assembled, even half-wrecked as it was now. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not suspicious, not grateful, something more complicated than either. "Fine," she said. "Then you need to have someone check those ribs in the morning." "I'll have my physician come to me." Of course he would. She began repacking her kit. "Your keys," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her right hand, where the keys were still threaded between her fingers. "Self-defense," she said. Something moved in his expression. Brief, almost imperceptible, but she had spent years reading the micro-expressions of people under stress. You walked into an active assault situation with keys between your fingers. "I also walked into it with a voice. Seemed to work." Another pause, then, "Why?" The question was asked with such directness, such genuine absence of social cushioning, that it briefly stopped her. "Why what? Why did you stop? Why did you involve yourself?" He watched her. "You don't know me. This part of the city has a particular reputation after dark. You had every reason to keep walking." Zuri looked at him for a moment, at the blood drying on his temple, the ruined suit, the controlled tension of a man who was in more pain than he would acknowledge to anyone, including himself. "You made a sound," she said simply. He didn't seem to know what to do with that either. She stood up, shouldered her bag, and took out her phone to call a car. Her feet had gone past screaming into a kind of resigned silence. She had worked in 9 hours. She had an overnight bag for her nephew to pack because she was watching him this weekend. She had 17 unread messages in her family group chat and a bowl of overnight oats in the fridge that she'd been looking forward to since noon. "What's your name?" Caspian Voss asked. She glanced at him. "Zuri Mensah." "Mensah," he repeated it like he was knotting it, like it was going somewhere specific in his mind. "Good night, Mr. Voss," she said, and walked to the mouth of the alley to wait for her car. She did not look back. She told herself this firmly and specifically, "Do not look back," and she didn't, but she was aware, with a precision that annoyed her slightly, of the exact weight of his gaze on her back as she walked away. It sat between her shoulder blades like a held breath. Caspian Orion Voss had not been afraid in a very long time. Fear required a kind of investment in outcomes that he had systematically dismantled over the course of his 39 years, and what remained in its place was a clean, operational clarity that served him considerably better in boardrooms, courtrooms, and apparently alleyways. He had been beaten up. He processed this without sentiment, the way he processed most things as data, and he had been helped, unexpectedly and without request, by a woman who carried a first aid kit and keys between her fingers and looked at him like he was a mildly interesting problem rather than the 13th wealthiest man in the country. That last part was the thing he kept returning to, sitting in the back of his car while Declan, his driver, navigated the empty late-night streets with his customary silence. Declan had found him at the mouth of the alley 11 minutes after Zuri Mensah had left. He had asked no questions, which was why he had been Caspian's driver for 6 years. He had simply noted the state of the suit, the blood, and the careful way Caspian was holding himself, and driven. Caspian sat with his hands flat on his thighs and looked out at the city. He had been in that alley for a reason he had told no one, planned with obsessive precision, and executed with the kind of controlled arrogance that comes from spending a decade being the smartest person in every room you enter. The ambush had not been part of the plan. The 2 masked men had introduced a variable he hadn't accounted for, which was a rarer experience than he would have liked to admit, and the fact that a woman in compression socks with a first aid kit had been the variable that neutralized them was something he was still, quietly, metabolizing. He pulled out his phone and typed the name into his private search. Zuri Mensah. The results came back sparse in the way that meant she didn't perform herself for the internet, which he found immediately interesting. A LinkedIn profile, registered nurse, Mercy General Hospital, 7 years. A brief mention in a community newsletter about a free health screening event she'd helped organize in the Veltham district. A photograph from what appeared to be a colleague's social media, Zuri in scrubs in a hospital break room, laughing at something out of frame, completely unaware of the camera. He looked at the photograph for longer than was necessary. Then he put his phone face down on the seat and watched the city pass. What do you think Caspian was really doing in that alley? Drop your theory in the comments, we'll get there. Caspian Voss had built his empire the way certain men build walls, not because anything specific was threatening them, but because the act of building had become indistinguishable from the act of living. He had grown up in Pelham Crest, which was the kind of address that appeared on embossed stationery and told people everything they needed to know and nothing they actually wanted to understand. His father, Rothwell Voss, had been a man of vast appetites and very small accountabilities, the sort of man who moved through the world leaving wreckage and calling it impact. Caspian had watched him for 18 years, cataloguing the damage with the detached precision of a child who has learned that feeling things fully is a luxury that costs too much. At 22, he had taken an inheritance worth $4 million and made a decision so counterintuitive it had been written about in 2 business school curricula since. He had given half of it away. Not to charity, to 11 specific individuals who had been directly harmed by his father's business practices. People his father had underpaid, dismissed, and in 3 cases, actively buried under litigation. Caspian had found each of them, made restitution without press coverage, and then taken the remaining 2 million and built something that his father's empire, for all its size, had never been: legitimate. This was not a story he told at galas or in profiles. It was the fact at the center of him, the load-bearing structure, and he kept it private with the same fierce, quiet intentionality that he kept everything that mattered. Voss Capital had grown over 17 years into a firm that managed 23 billion in assets. It occupied 4 floors of the Aldrin Tower and employed 214 people, the majority of whom found their CEO competent, demanding, and about as warm as a well-lit operating theatre. His reputation in Dellwick's business community was precise. He was brilliant, ruthless when necessary, and had a particular talent for identifying when someone was lying that made negotiations with him feel, as one counterpart had once described it, like being cross-examined by someone who already has the verdict. What they didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that for the past 8 months, Caspian had been building a second operation entirely, one that had nothing to do with asset management. Its name internally was Project Holloway. And the alley where he'd been beaten, Calloway Lane, was directly adjacent to the building at the center of it. 3 days after the alley, a package arrived at the nurses' station of Mercy General's emergency department. Zuri was at the far end of the ward checking in on a post-procedure patient when her colleague Priya appeared at her elbow, with the expression she reserved for things she found either alarming or extremely interesting, and this appeared to be both. "There's a delivery for you," Priya said, hand-delivered, by a man in a suit that I'm fairly confident cost more than my car. Zuri finished updating the chart. "Who from?" "It's got a card." The package was a flat rectangular box, charcoal grey, tied with a single dark ribbon, no logo, no branding, the kind of packaging that communicated luxury by refusing to announce it. The card inside was cream-colored with the kind of weight that meant it had been made somewhere that still cared about such things. "Ms. Mensah, your intervention 3 nights ago prevented a significant disruption to my schedule. Enclosed is a token of acknowledgement. It is not gratitude. I don't traffic in gratitude. Consider it a professional recognition of effective fieldwork. See Voss." Inside the box, a first aid kit, not the practical, standard-issue kind she carried. This one was custom, a slim, matte black case, clearly bespoke, containing medical-grade supplies organized with an attention to detail that told her someone had either consulted a professional or was one. An ice pack that activated on compression. Proper suture strips, not the budget butterfly kind. A penlight, trauma shears. A folded card inside with a number. Priya was reading over her shoulder. "He said it's not gratitude." "I see that. That's a very strange way to say thank you." "I think it's actually a very accurate way to say thank you for him." Zuri studied the kit for a moment. "He doesn't want to be in my debt. This is him making it transactional so he can be even." Priya looked at her. "You got all that from a first aid kit?" "I got all that from the card." She put the kit in her locker and went back to work and did not think about Caspian Voss for the rest of her shift, which took a moderate amount of effort and which she would not have admitted to anyone. That evening in her apartment, the second-floor unit of a converted brownstone in Veltham, a neighborhood that had been described in real estate listings as emerging, for so long it had become a kind of ambient joke, she sat on her couch with a bowl of jollof rice her mother had sent over and the folded card in her hand. The number was handwritten, not typed, not a business card, handwritten in a script that was controlled and slightly impatient-looking, like someone who writes quickly because their thoughts move faster than the pen. She thought about the sound he'd made in the alley, the one that had stopped her feet. She thought about the way he'd said "I don't traffic in gratitude," because anyone who had to say that out loud had clearly thought about it enough to have developed a policy. She thought about the fury in his eyes when she'd first crouched beside him, not at the men who had beaten him, at the situation, at the loss of control. She put the card on her coffee table and ate her jollof rice and watched 20 minutes of a documentary about migratory birds before she picked the card back up, and with the particular decisiveness of someone who has talked themselves out of something and then talked themselves back in, typed the number into her phone. She didn't call, she sent a text. "The kit is good, better than mine, Zuri Mensah." The response came 4 minutes later. "I know." She stared at it. Then, against her better judgment, and against her more skeptical nature, and against several things her mother had taught her about men who lead with arrogance, she laughed. They met for coffee 11 days later, which was how long it took for their schedules to produce an overlapping hour that worked for both of them. A logistical negotiation that Zuri managed from her end, with the efficiency of someone who routinely coordinates care plans for multiple patients, and that Caspian managed from his end, with a personal assistant who sent her a calendar invite with the precision of a military briefing. The cafe he suggested was in the Rendell district, which was not near his office or her hospital, a neutral location, she noted, which meant he'd thought about the geography of the meeting. She filed this. She arrived 3 minutes early and was surprised to find him already there, which meant he'd arrived before that. He was in a charcoal suit, different from the destroyed one, seated at a corner table with his back to the wall and a clear sightline to the door, another thing she noticed and filed. He stood when she approached, which surprised her.
"Get away from him!"
"Ms. Mensah, Mr. Voss, you look significantly better than the last time I saw you." "That's a low bar." "It is," she agreed and sat down. This was how it began, not with charm, not with performance, but with a quality that Zuri had not expected from a man of his reputation: directness. He asked her questions with the genuine curiosity of someone who actually wanted the information, not the social lubricant version of questions that people ask to fill silence. He asked about her work at the hospital, not in the polite, glazed way wealthy people sometimes asked about service professions, but with specific follow-up questions that suggested he was listening to the answers. He asked how long she'd lived in Veltham, and when she mentioned the neighborhood's complicated relationship with gentrification, he didn't pivot to something more comfortable. He stayed in it. She asked about his business. He told her about Voss Capital in the way you describe a house you've lived in for a long time, fluently, knotting the floors without being asked. He didn't perform humility and he didn't perform pride. He simply described it. She asked carefully, "What were you doing in Calloway Lane that night?" The quality of his stillness changed, not noticeable to most people, very noticeable to Zuri. "A meeting," he said. "At midnight." It was a particular kind of meeting. The kind that happens in alleys at midnight. He looked at her across the table. "Yes." She nodded slowly, and the two men were not random. The sentence landed between them with weight. She let it sit there for a moment, giving it the space it deserved. "Are you in danger?" Something in his expression shifted, not softening, exactly, more like a wall developing a hairline crack that it wasn't aware of yet. That's a nurse's question. "I'm a nurse." Most people would have asked what I was involved in. Most people would be asking because they were afraid or curious. I'm asking because of the ribs. Another of those particular silences. Then, I'm managing it. That's what people say right before they stop managing it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "You're very difficult to deflect." "Years of practice," she said. "Patients lie constantly. You learn to read past the words." "And what are you reading past mine?" She considered him, the careful posture, the controlled expression, The way he occupied space, as if he had long since decided exactly how much of it he was entitled to, and had never questioned that decision. "That you're used to being the person who has all the information," she said, "and that you're currently in a situation where you don't, and that it's costing you something." The cafe hummed around them, steam and low conversation, and the particular warmth of a morning in October just beginning to tip toward cold. Caspian Voss looked at Zuri Mensah across a small table and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. "You're right," he said finally. It sounded like something that didn't happen often. "What would you do if someone like Caspian Voss walked into your life? Comment below, would you trust him?" Project Holloway in its full form was this. A year prior, Caspian had received documentation, anonymously delivered, verified through 3 separate forensic accountants, detailing a scheme that reached into the uppermost chambers of Dellwick City's financial infrastructure. At the center of it was a man named Aldous Pren. 71 years old, third-generation wealth, the kind of legacy name that appeared on hospital wings and university libraries, and had been appearing on fraudulent investment vehicles for over a decade. Pren had been siphoning retirement funds. Not dramatically, not in the headline way of Ponzi schemes built on spectacle and greed. Methodically, quietly, in increments small enough to survive individual audits. The victims were not institutions. They were individuals, teachers, sanitation workers, hospital staff, transit employees, people whose pension funds moved through a management vehicle that Pren's firm had acquired in what had appeared at the time to be a routine acquisition. The total, across 11 years, was $460 million. The documentation Caspian had received implicated not just Pren, but 3 city regulatory officials who had been facilitating the scheme in exchange for payments routed through a property development subsidiary. The payments were untraceable through conventional means. The documentation was exceptionally detailed. Whoever had compiled it had either extraordinary access or extraordinary patience, and possibly both. Caspian had spent 8 months building a legal case. Not through official channels. The regulatory officials made official channels a compromised option. Through a private architecture of forensic accountants, a retired federal investigator named Gwyneth Solari, and a network of contacts he had cultivated over 17 years precisely for situations that didn't fit conventional frameworks. The midnight meeting in Callaway Lane had been with an informant, a former Pren employee who had agreed to provide testimony in exchange for protections that Caspian had arranged. The 2 masked men had been a warning. Someone in Pren's circle knew the case was being assembled. The informant had not been there, had in fact sent a message 40 minutes after the attack that read simply, "They came to my house too, I'm out." This left Caspian with a case that was close, 8 months close, but missing the human testimony required to make it prosecutable. He told Zuri none of this during their first coffee. He told her some of it during their 3rd meeting 2 weeks later, when she asked again about the alley, and he found, to his genuine surprise, that the question didn't irritate him the way questions about his private operations usually did. He told her the shape of it, a financial scheme, powerful people, a case being built, a setback. She listened the way she did everything, completely, without interrupting, with the focused attention of someone who is processing rather than simply receiving. When he finished, she said, "How many people had their retirement money taken?" "Current estimate. Around 8,000 affected individuals." She was quiet for a moment. "I work with 3 people whose pension is through a city fund. One of them is saving to bring her mother here from the Philippines. Another just sent his daughter to college on the assumption that the fund would be there when he retired." She looked at him. "You need to finish this." "I'm aware." "No, I mean," she paused, searching for the precise thing. "Some things can't be left half-done, not this." He looked at her across the table, across the coffee, across the ordinary Thursday afternoon, across the 11 days and 2 conversations, and growing awareness of her that had become, without announcement, the most interesting thing currently happening in his life. "I know," he said. What developed between them was not a romance in the traditional architecture of romances. It was more like two people discovering, with equal parts relief and alarm, that they had been built with complementary load-bearing structures, that the places where one was rigid, the other had learned flexibility, that the places where one kept silence, the other had learned when silence was honesty and when it was avoidance. Zuri was not awed by him. This was, Caspian came to understand, the rarest thing anyone had given him in years. His world was populated by people who either wanted something from him or were threatened by him, and both postures involved a kind of performance that exhausted him without his having named it as exhaustion. Zuri looked at him with clear eyes and said whatever she actually thought, and disagreed with him without hostility and agreed with him without flattery, and when he said something worth pushing back on, she pushed. She was, he told Declan one evening after he'd dropped Zuri home, the least manageable person I've encountered in recent memory. Declan, eyes on the road, said, "You seem remarkably undisturbed by that." Caspian didn't answer. Declan took this as its own kind of answer. For Zuri, it was more complicated. She had a life she had built with intention, her career, her community, her family, the particular rhythms of a person who knows what she has and protects it. She had watched her mother love a man who was never quite present, always half-turned towards something larger and more demanding than the domestic world they'd built, and she had made herself a quiet internal promise somewhere in her early 20s that she would not build her life around a man who treated the world around him as secondary. Caspian Voss was, on paper, exactly the wrong shape. And yet, he showed up when he said he would. He listened with the same quality of attention he brought to financial analysis, not performatively, but functionally, as if the information mattered and he intended to use it. He remembered things she'd mentioned in passing, the name of her nephew, Kofi, the documentary she'd been watching, the name of the colleague whose mother was trying to immigrate. One evening he called and asked her to describe what good jollof rice tasted like, because he'd never had it, and she'd mentioned it 3 times, and he wanted to understand why. She described it, at length, with the particular passion of someone for whom food is love made edible. He went quiet in that specific way he had. "What?" she said. "You light up when you talk about things you love." "Everyone does." "No," he said, "they don't." 6 weeks after the alley, Zuri noticed something at work. A man she didn't recognize had been in the emergency waiting area twice in 1 week. Not unusual in itself, the emergency department had regulars, people who used it as a primary care substitute, people working through situations they didn't have other resources to address. But this man was not presenting for treatment. Both times she'd seen him, he was sitting in the waiting area with the posture of someone who was watching the room rather than waiting for anything in it. The second time, he made eye contact with her for a beat too long before looking away. She mentioned it to Caspian that evening. The silence on his end of the phone was different from his usual silences, shorter, tighter. "Describe him." She did. "Don't walk to your car alone this week," he said. "Tell me your shifts." Caspian. "Zuri. Tell me what's happening." Another pause. When I said someone in Pren's circle knew about the case, I meant they knew about the case generally. I may have been overly optimistic about the scope of what they know. The cold she felt had nothing to do with the temperature of her apartment. "You think they know about me?" "I think they're determining whether you're relevant." "And am I?" "Not to the case, but you've been seen with me publicly, and people like Aldous Pren prefer to operate in a world where anyone adjacent to a threat can be assessed, and if necessary, used." She sat with this, the particular stillness of a person absorbing something that changes the shape of their situation. "Why didn't you tell me sooner that associating with you had risks?" The pause this time was different again, something in it she couldn't fully parse. "I should have," he said. "I didn't because, a beat, I was being selfish." She had not expected him to say that. She suspected he hadn't expected to either. "I need you to let your security person drive me to work," she said, "temporarily, until this is resolved. Already arranged, if you agree to it." And Caspian. Yes. Finish the case. 3 days later, everything broke at once. Gwyneth Solari, the retired federal investigator who had been the structural backbone of the Holloway case, called Caspian at 6 a.m. and said 4 words in a voice stripped entirely of its professional calm. They got to Brentmore. Brentmore was the name of the forensic accountant who held the master file, the compiled, cross-referenced documentation that turned 8 months of investigative work from a collection of evidence into an actionable legal weapon. He had been found by his wife at 5:30 a.m., unharmed physically but entirely unreachable mentally, not from violence but from something that had been administered, she told the paramedics, with the coffee he'd had with a new client the previous afternoon. The file, which existed in triplicate across encrypted drives, was gone, all 3 copies, simultaneously. Meaning someone had accessed information about the backup locations. Meaning the breach was deeper than Caspian had understood. He sat in his office at 6:15 a.m. and did something he very rarely did. He let himself be still inside the crisis rather than immediately moving. He sat with the specific quality of a man who has built something for 8 months and watched it be surgically dismantled by people who had been watching him do it. He thought about 8,000 pension holders, a teacher saving for retirement, a man who had sent his daughter to college. He thought about Zuri saying, "Some things can't be left half done." His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Walk away from Holloway, Mr. Voss. You've been extraordinarily thorough. Don't make us be equally thorough about you." He read it 3 times. Then he called Gwyneth. "How much of the case lives in your head?" he asked. "Enough," she said, "but heads aren't admissible." "Not yet, give me 72 hours. Caspian. 72 hours, Gwyneth. He ended the call and sat for a moment. Then he called Zuri. She picked up on the second ring. He could hear the hospital in the background, the particular layered sound of an emergency department in the early morning. "Are you okay?" she asked immediately, because she always asked that first. "No," he said, because he had learned from her that accuracy was worth more than performance. "Something happened, I need to tell you, and I need to ask you something, and I need you to know before I ask it that the answer can be no." A brief pause. "I'm on break in 7 minutes, don't start without me." He didn't. "If you were Zuri, would you stay? Comment below. This is where it gets real." What he asked her was this. There was a city council member named Thomasine Wick, 44 years old, 3rd term, representing the Veltham district, Zuri's district. She was not implicated in Holloway. She had in fact spent 2 years on a task force examining pension fund management irregularities, had raised flags internally that had been dismissed by 2 of the 3 regulatory officials now identified as complicit, and had subsequently, and this was the piece, been systematically sidelined from the Financial Oversight Committee she'd requested to join. Caspian had been reluctant to approach her for 6 months because proximity to an elected official introduced variables that could compromise or politicize the case. But the compromise of the document files had changed the calculation. Thomasine Wick had her own documented concerns, her own paper trail. And critically, the institutional standing to call for an independent audit through a channel that bypassed the compromised regulatory officials entirely. But she needed to be approached by someone she trusted, someone from her district, someone with no financial or political skin in the game. "She comes to our free health screening," Zuri said slowly. "Has for 2 years. She helped us get the venue." "I know." A silence. "You knew that when you met me." "I knew it afterward when I looked you up." How long have you known?
6 weeks.
And you didn't ask me until now. No, he said, because I didn't want to ask you. I didn't want you in this further than you already were, and I didn't want you to wonder whether. He stopped. Then, with the particular precision of someone choosing words carefully because the wrong ones would cost something, whether I had sought you out for a reason. I didn't. You found me in an alley, and everything since then has been another stop, separate from this. Zuri stood in the hospital break room, the documentary about birds poster that someone had put up ironically, and that had somehow become beloved, the ancient coffee machine, the window with its limited sky, and she thought about what it meant that he had sat with this information for 6 weeks and said nothing. You could have told me sooner and I might have helped sooner, she said.
Yes.
Why didn't you? A pause that had more inside it than usual, because you matter more than the case. The break room was very quiet. I'll talk to Thomasine, she said.
Zuri.
I'll talk to her, she deserves to know, and those 8,000 people deserve what you've been building. A beat, but Caspian.
Yes.
After this is done, you and I are going to have a very direct conversation about the difference between protecting someone and keeping things from them. I know, he said. I'm looking forward to it, actually.
She could hear in his voice that he meant it.
Thomasine Wick was a small woman with large energy, the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately changed its center of gravity without appearing to try. She had natural hair going silver at the temples and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead, and the particular eyes of a person who had been lied to by powerful people enough times to have developed a reliable early warning system. She met Zuri at the community center on a Thursday afternoon, in the same room where the health screenings happened, which felt appropriate. Zuri had brought her own file, printed, organized, the documentation that Caspian had been able to reconstruct, and the outline of what had been lost and what remained. Thomasine read it in silence for 22 minutes. Then she looked up. The Brentmore accountant, she said, is he going to recover? His doctors expect a full recovery. The drug they used was yes, he'll be fine. And Voss? Building a new case architecture. What was destroyed can be partially reconstructed. What can't be reconstructed needs a different entry point. And that's me. That's the audit channel, which you have standing to initiate. Thomasine removed her reading glasses from her forehead and turned them slowly in her hands. You know what this costs, politically. I know. The people who are going to come after me have been in this city since before I was born. I know that too. Why are you doing this? You specifically, Zuri. You could walk away from this. You don't have a stake the way Voss does. Zuri thought about the colleague saving for her mother's immigration, the man whose daughter was in college, the 8,000 people who had gone to work every day, trusting that the system would hold what they put into it. I work in emergency medicine, she said. I got into it because I believe that when someone is in trouble, the people with the capacity to help have a responsibility to do so. She paused. This is the same thing, on a bigger scale. Thomasine studied her for a long moment. Then she looked back at the file. Give me 48 hours, she said. I need to talk to my attorney and I need to talk to my husband.
Stop!
A beat.
Get away from
And then
him!
I'm going to need everything Voss has left. Those 48 hours were the longest of the entire operation. Caspian worked through both nights, him and Gwyneth and a new forensic accountant named Rael Osai, who had been Gwyneth's recommendation, and who turned out to be a 20-something with an earring and an incomprehensible ability to find patterns in financial data. The new case architecture was different from the original, leaner, more targeted, dependent less on volume of documentation, and more on the precision of 3 or 4 irrefutable pieces. On the second night, Zuri came to his office. She appeared at 11 p.m. with a container of jollof rice and the particular expression of someone who has decided to do something and is not going to be talked out of it. She set the rice on his desk. She looked at the whiteboards covered in his architectural scrawl, the timeline, the flow of money, the names.
"Aight," she said.
He looked at her. "Zuri. You've been here since yesterday morning. You will make worse decisions hungry than fed. Eat."
He ate.
Rael, from behind his laptop, quietly accepted the portion she offered him without being asked, with the instinctive recognition of someone who identifies a person used to feeding people. Gwyneth, coming in from the adjacent room with coffee, looked at Zuri and then looked at Caspian and then looked back at Zuri with an expression that was too old and too experienced to be surprised by anything, but that was clearly, quietly pleased. It was past midnight when Caspian sat back from the whiteboard and said, "There." Gwyneth and Rael both looked. The reconstruction wasn't complete. It would never be as comprehensive as the original, but what remained, the three irrefutable pieces, laid against Thomasine Wick's institutional standing and her own documented concerns, was enough. Not a perfect case, a real one. "Will it hold?" Zuri asked. "Yes," Gwyneth said. She sounded like a person who has seen many things not hold and knows the difference. "It'll hold." Caspian looked at Zuri across the office, across the whiteboard and the open containers and the particular wreckage of 2 sleepless nights. She looked back at him. "Thank you," he said. He didn't qualify it, didn't reroute it into something transactional. He just said it. "I know," she said. He laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh, the kind that comes before the person has decided to allow it. Gwyneth, from across the room, did not look up from her papers, but was, demonstrably, smiling. Thomasine Wick filed the request for an independent audit on a Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, it had been reported by 2 financial journalists who had been chasing peripheral threads of the story for months and recognized immediately what the audit filing meant. By Wednesday, Aldous Pren's attorneys had issued 3 statements. By Thursday, 2 of the 3 implicated regulatory officials had retained criminal defense counsel. On Friday, Pren himself, in a move that Caspian had not predicted, and Gwyneth said meant the internal panic had crested faster than expected, issued a public statement that attempted to reframe the narrative and succeeded only in confirming several facts that had not yet been publicly established. The unraveling, when it came quickly. These things always do, once the first thread is properly pulled. The full investigation was formally opened the following week by an independent body operating outside the compromised regulatory structure. Gwyneth was brought in as a consultant. Rael's financial analysis became a cornerstone document. Thomasine Wick, in a televised statement delivered with the particular calm of someone who has been waiting a long time for a door to open, called it an overdue reckoning with a system that had been protected for too long by the assumption that no one was watching. Caspian watched the statement from his office. Alone, because Declan had the day off and Gwyneth was with the investigators, and Rael had gone home to sleep for the first time in 4 days. He watched it and felt something that he had not felt in a very long time, something he had dismantled so carefully in his 20s that he'd almost forgotten its texture. Something that felt improbably like relief. The evening after Thomasine's statement, Caspian drove to Veltham. He had Declan drop him 2 streets from Zuri's building, and he walked the rest of the way, which was a thing he almost never did in this city, walked without a destination strategy, without a sightline calculation, without the baseline operational awareness that had become indistinguishable from his resting state. He walked through the Veltham streets in the October evening. The trees doing the thing October trees do, burning orange and refusing to apologize for it, and he thought about his father and his mother, and the $4 million he'd split in half at 22, and the 8 months of Holloway and the particular sound a person makes when pain arrives faster than their mind can follow it. He thought about a woman with keys between her fingers walking into an alley because someone made a sound. He rang her bell. She buzzed him in without asking who it was, which meant she'd seen him on the entry camera, which meant she'd been expecting him, which was, he thought, climbing the stairs, the most Zuri thing possible. She opened the door before he knocked. She was in a sweater the color of dark amber, and her hair was out, and she was holding a mug of something that smelled like ginger and honey. "You walked from Callaway," she said. "2 streets over." Still, he stood in her doorway. He hadn't planned what to say. He had been, for the first time in many years, operating without a plan. "I wanted to tell you in person," he said, "that it's moving, that it's going to." He stopped, because she was looking at him with an expression that made the prepared words unnecessary, that it's going to be okay, for the 8,000 people. "I know," she said, "I watched the statement." "I know you did." A small quiet. "Come in," she said, "I made tea." He came in. That was the beginning, properly. Not the alley was the collision. Not the coffee, or the escalating trust, or the 2 nights rebuilding a case from its rubble. Those were the building. The evening in her apartment, with October visible through her window, and the tea growing cool on the table between them as they talked until nearly midnight about nothing related to cases or schemes or pension funds. About his mother's garden and her grandmother's recipe, and the specific quality of light in Accra that she'd only seen in photographs, but described with such precision it became visible. That was the beginning. He did not stay. He left at 11:40, because she had an early shift, and because neither of them was the sort of person who rushed the architecture of something they wanted to last. At the door he paused. "The case," he said. "I want to be transparent with you about something." "Okay. I told you I looked you up and found your connection to Thomasine afterward, and that I didn't approach you about it until I had no other option. Both of those things are true." A pause. "But I also want to be honest that when I look at how things unfolded, I should have told you sooner. Not about the case, about the risk. You deserve to make an informed choice from the beginning." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "you should have, and you didn't, and that's something we're going to work on." "I know. You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." She studied him for a moment, the careful posture, the controlled expression, the hairline cracks in the wall that were becoming, incrementally, something closer to windows. "I'll see you next week," she said. "There's a Ghanaian place in Rendell I want to take you to. You need to understand jollof rice in person, not through description." "I'm aware of that," he said. "I've been aware of it for some time." She laughed. He left. She leaned against her closed door in the amber sweater October evening, and held her mug of cooling tea, and felt the particular warmth of a happiness that was solid rather than spectacular. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that arrives in a doorway and asks for tea and talks until midnight and means what it says. What moment in this story got you? Drop a timestamp and a comment. We read every single one. The investigation ran for 14 months. Aldous Pren was indicted on 7 counts. 2 of the 3 regulatory officials pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperation. The third fought it and lost, which Gwyneth had predicted with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has spent 40 years watching people miscalculate the durability of their own power. The pension funds were not fully recovered. They never are, and Zuri had understood this before she'd walked into the community center with the file. But a significant portion was clawed back through asset seizure, and the 8,000 affected individuals were notified, and the independent oversight body that Thomasine's audit had catalyzed became permanent, with a board that included, because Thomasine was thorough in the way that mattered, 3 representatives from pension fund stakeholder groups. One of them was a sanitation worker from the Veltham district. Caspian was not present for the announcement of the indictments. He was in a small, nondescript conference room with Gwyneth and Rail and Thomasine Wick, watching the press briefing on a laptop with the particular atmosphere of people who have been through something together that they will not speak about publicly and do not need to. When it ended, Thomasine looked at Caspian across the table. "Your father's name is on the Aldrin Tower," she said, not accusingly, observationally. "Yes."
And your name is on the case that just dismantled Aldous Pren, who was his contemporary and social peer.
Yes.
She nodded slowly. Is this about him? Caspian was quiet for a moment. Then, it became about something else. Thomasine looked at him with the eyes of a person who has the good judgment not to ask the follow-up question. She picked up her reading glasses from the table and stood. Tell Zuri she's welcome at the screening next month, she said. We're expanding to include cardiac assessments, and we could use her expertise. She'll be there, Caspian said. She already signed up. Thomasine smiled, a quick, unguarded thing, the kind that means something. Of course she did. Zuri was at the hospital when the indictments were announced. She was in the middle of a 12-hour shift, elbow deep in the ordinary chaos of an emergency department on a Thursday afternoon, a pediatric asthma case in Bay 3, a laceration in Bay 7, the ambient hum of a department doing what emergency departments do, which is hold the line between crisis and continuity. She saw the notification on her phone during a 2-minute pause at the nurse's station. Read the headline, read the first 3 lines of the article, put the phone in her pocket. Then she stood for a moment at the station with the chart in her hands and felt something move through her quietly, not triumph, exactly, something more like resolution, the click of a thing settling into its correct place. Priya appeared beside her. What? Nothing. Indictments came through. Priya looked at her. The pension funds thing. Yeah. Isn't that the thing with? Yeah. Priya studied her with the thorough, fond attention of a person who has worked alongside someone for 4 years and knows most of their tells. You okay? Zuri looked up from the chart. Yeah, she said, I really am. She was. That evening, Caspian came to the hospital to pick her up after her shift. He had started doing this 3 months in, not every day, not performatively, but with the kind of reliable presence that builds trust through repetition rather than grand gesture. He was always on time, always had the car warm, always brought coffee or tea depending on what kind of day she'd indicated she was having. Today he was outside in the grey October evening, with 2 cups of something, and the particular expression of a man who has finished something significant, and is still deciding what it feels like. She took her cup. They stood on the hospital steps for a moment. How does it feel? She asked. He thought about it. Strange, he said. Like I've been building toward this for so long that the space it occupied doesn't know what to do with itself. What do you want to put in the space? He looked at her. In the particular light of a city evening, his eyes were the color she'd catalogued in the alley all those months ago, October ocean, the shade of the sea when summer has finally released it. I have some ideas, he said. She smiled. So do I. They walked to the car together, shoulder to shoulder in the early dark of an autumn evening, the city doing what cities do, moving, breathing, holding its multitudes, indifferent and magnificent and full of alleys and amber light, and the particular sound a person makes when they've decided to stop walking past and start walking toward. But 3 weeks later, Zuri found the letter. It had been slipped under her apartment door sometime between 11 p.m. and when she woke at 6. No envelope, a single folded sheet of paper, plain, with 8 words written in the center in careful block letters. He knew who you were before the alley. She stood in her hallway in the grey pre-dawn holding the paper. Her first reaction was a long, very still silence inside herself, the kind she'd learned to inhabit in crisis situations, the space before assessment where you simply let the information be present without immediately processing it. He knew who you were before the alley. She thought about Caspian's exact words, spoken to her multiple times. I looked you up afterward. I found the connection to Thomasine after the alley. She thought about the first aid kit, arriving with such precise speed, the immediate neutrality of the meeting location, the way he'd asked her questions, from their very first coffee, with the depth of someone who had already spent time thinking about her. She thought about 8 months. She thought about the construction of a case. She thought about 8,000 people and a retired investigator and a forensic accountant and all the meticulous architecture of someone who plans 14 moves ahead. She stood in her hallway with the letter and felt the ground not shake exactly, shift, the way ground shifts before you know what caused it. She put the letter on the counter. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table in the grey early morning and thought about what she knew and what she had been told and the space between those two things, which had just become, unexpectedly, the most important space in her life. Then she picked up her phone and called Caspian. He answered on the first ring. His voice said he hadn't been asleep. "I need to see you," she said, "today." A pause on his end, the particular kind that told her he already knew something had happened. "I'll come now," he said. "Don't come yet," she said. "I need an hour first." "Zuri." 1 hour, Caspian. She ended the call. Sat in the morning quiet. Drank her coffee. And for 57 minutes, sat with the oldest and most important question in the architecture of any human connection. What do you do when the person who changed everything might have planned to find you? The answer, when it came quietly, the way the real answers always do. She picked up her phone, typed one message. "Come now and tell me everything, all of it, from the beginning." The 3 dots appeared immediately. Then his reply. "On my way, and yes, all of it." She sat with that. Outside her window, Veltham was waking up, the first bus going past, someone's door opening and closing, the city beginning its daily insistence on moving forward. The October trees had finished burning. Their branches were bare now, clean-lined against a sky the color of old pewter. She watched them. Waited. And the knock, when it came from a man who had driven across the city in the early morning, with the full weight of everything he had not yet said. And she stood at her door with the letter on the counter, and the coffee growing cold, and 8 months of trust, that was either the realest thing she'd ever built, or the most elaborate architecture she'd ever walked into. And she opened it. What do you think he's about to tell her? And do you think she should stay? Drop your thoughts, because this story isn't finished yet. He looked terrible. That was the first thing she noticed, and she noticed it with the clinical precision of someone who has spent years reading bodies before they speak. He had driven across the city in the early morning, and he had not slept, and the careful architecture of his face, the controlled jaw, the managed expression, the wall that she had watched develop hairline cracks over months, was gone. Not cracked. Gone. What was underneath, it was something rawer and more complicated than anything she had seen from him before, and she had seen him in an alley with broken ribs and a bleeding temple, and 2 masked men walking away into the dark. He was more undone now than he had been then. He stepped inside when she moved back from the door. She didn't hug him. She didn't reach for him. She moved to the kitchen and poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the table next to the letter, which she had left there on purpose, face up, because she was not going to start this conversation with theatre. He saw it immediately. He stood at the table and looked at it for a long moment. His hands were at his sides. He didn't pick it up. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She sat across from him. The table between them felt different from every other time she had sat across from him. The cafe in Rendell, the hospital break room, his office with the whiteboards, her couch with the documentary about migratory birds. All of those surfaces had been neutral. This one had the letter on it. This one had the question on it. "Start from the beginning," she said. "The actual beginning, not the version where you found me in the alley and looked me up afterward." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He looked at her with the October ocean eyes, and she could see him deciding not whether to tell her. She understood that he had already decided that in the car on the way here, had probably decided it the moment his phone rang. But how? how to dismantle something you built with a specific architecture and reconstruct it honestly in real time in front of the person it most concerned. "I knew your name before the alley," he said. The room was very quiet. "How long before?" 4 months. She absorbed this, kept her face even, not cold, not performed. Even, the way she held herself when information was arriving faster than the comfortable version of her wanted to process it. From Thomasine. From Gwyneth, she was mapping the community infrastructure around the Veltham district. Anyone with standing, trust, organic relationships with the people who would ultimately be the most affected by Holloway. Thomasine Wick was the institutional piece, but she needed, Gwyneth's word was grounding, someone the community trusted at the human level, not the political level. He paused. "Your name came up in 3 separate contexts, the health screenings. A community board meeting where you spoke about healthcare access. A letter you'd written to a local paper about the pension fund irregularities 2 years ago, before anyone was building a case." Zuri went still. "I wrote that letter." "You wrote that letter," he said, "and you were right about everything in it, 2 years before I had documentation to prove it." She remembered the letter. She had written it at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon after her colleague Marcus had come in looking wrecked because his pension statement didn't match what he'd been told to expect. She had written it out of frustration, not strategy. She had not expected it to go anywhere. It had been published in the Veltham Community Gazette, which had a readership of approximately 4,000 people and an online presence that was, generously, modest. Someone had been reading. "So Gwyneth flagged me as a potential asset," she said. The word came out flat, clinical, because she was not going to dress it in anything softer until she had the full shape of it. "Yes." "And you what? Put me on a list." "I knew your name, I knew your work at the hospital, your connection to the community, your relationship with Thomasine. I had not," he stopped, pressed his hands flat on the table. "I had not decided what to do with the information, whether approaching you was the right call, whether the risk to you was justifiable, whether it compromised the case to involve someone outside the core team. A beat. I was still thinking about it when you walked into that alley." Zuri looked at him. "The alley was real," she said. It was not a question. She needed to hear him say it. "The alley was real. I was there for the informant. The 2 men were Pren's people. None of that was," he met her eyes. "None of it was arranged. If I had arranged anything in that alley, I would not have arranged to be on the ground with 3 cracked ribs." "2," she said automatically. Something flickered in his expression. 2 cracked ribs. You were very specific about that at the time. "I'm a nurse." "You are." A silence that was different from the ones before it, not empty, not hostile, dense, full of things that were being sorted in real time. "The coffee," she said, 11 days after the first meeting. "I called you," he said, "not through a handler, not through an assistant's calendar management. I called because I wanted to see you. The case was, yes, it was in my mind, it is always in my mind, but it was not why I called." A pause. "You know it wasn't." She did know. She had known then, and she knew now, and the knowing was the most complicated part of this, because it would have been significantly easier to sit here if she didn't know. "The kit," she said, "the first aid kit, was exactly what the card said it was. Professional recognition of effective fieldwork. And also," he stopped, then, "with the care of someone placing something fragile on a surface and not entirely sure it will hold. Also the only socially acceptable way I could find at that point to tell you that I thought about you after you walked away, that you had," he exhaled. "I don't do this fluently. I've noticed." "I know." "Stop saying that." "I can't stop saying it because I keep meaning it," he said, and there was a rawness in his voice that she had not heard before, something unfiltered, something that had been waiting behind all that careful articulation for an exit. Zuri looked at him across the table, the letter between them, the early morning light making slow progress through her window, the city outside waking up into its ordinary Thursday. Here is what I need to know, she said, and I need you to answer it accurately, not protectively, not in the version that makes things easier. He nodded. At any point, Caspian, was being with me a strategy? Was any part of what happened between us something you did, because of what I could give the case? He didn't answer immediately. She gave him the silence. She had learned, was still learning, that his silences were not evasions. They were the sound of him refusing to answer before he was certain the answer was true. No, he said, the opposite. She waited. The opposite meaning the case gave me the reason to know your name, and then you gave me a reason to resent the case. A beat. Every time the Holloway question arose in relation to you, I postponed it. You noticed that I sat on the Thomasine question for 6 weeks. It was 6 weeks because every time I approached the decision, I found a reason not to do it. I told myself it was strategic caution. It wasn't. He looked at her directly. It was because I didn't want to be the person who used you. And I was afraid that the moment I asked you for anything case-related, that's what I would become. You still didn't tell me about the risk. No, that was inexcusable. I told myself I was protecting you, and I was also protecting myself from having to tell you I'd known your name for 4 months before you found me bleeding in an alley. Both things were true at once, and one of them was selfish, and I own that. Zuri sat with everything. She was not a person who made decisions from the center of an emotional storm. She never had been. She made decisions the way she did everything, by going still inside the storm and finding the solid ground at the bottom of it. The solid ground, she discovered, was this. She had walked into an alley because a stranger made a sound. She had cleaned his wounds while he told her not to. She had gone to coffee with him and pushed past his deflections and watched his walls develop hairline cracks and felt the particular gravity of a person you recognize without having met before. She had stood in a community center with a file and looked at Thomasine Wick and said some things can't be left half done. She had brought jollof rice to a man working through the night and sat in his office until midnight and felt, in the quality of the silence between them, something that did not feel like strategy or calculation or the managed machinery of a case. It had felt like two people who had found something true. The question was whether something true could also have a complicated origin. She thought about her own letter, written on a Sunday afternoon out of frustration, published in a small gazette, read by someone she'd never know. She had not written it strategically. She had written it because she saw something wrong and had the capacity to say so. And that letter had put her name in a file that ended up in the hands of a man who had been building a case for 8 months. And then that man had ended up bleeding in her alley. And she had stopped. Life, she thought, was not clean. The origins of things were rarely clean. What mattered, what had always mattered, in her work and in her life and in the letter she'd written on a Sunday and the alley she'd walked into on a Thursday night, was what you did once you were in it. She looked at Caspian. He was watching her with the careful stillness of a man who understands, fully, that he is not the one who gets to determine the outcome of this moment, that he has said everything he can say, that what happens next belongs entirely to her. This, she thought, was also something, that he knew that he sat with it. I need you to understand something, she said. Okay. I don't require a perfect history. I'm not looking for someone whose path to me was uncomplicated and clean. She held his gaze. What I require is honesty going forward, not protection disguised as silence, not strategy disguised as care. If you know something I should know, you tell me. If there's a risk I should be assessing, you give me the information and let me assess it. You don't manage me. I understand. Do you? Because understanding it intellectually and doing it are two different things for you. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, the precursor to one. You're the least manageable person I've ever encountered, he said. I know, she said. And there it was, the same word, her word, returned to her, and it landed between them and cracked the tension of the morning open, and she felt the laugh rise in her chest before she could decide about it, and it came out quiet and genuine, and he looked at her when it did with the expression she'd been watching accumulate across all these months, the one that had started as a hairline crack and had become, unmistakably, a window. "The letter," she said. "Who sent it?" His expression steadied. "I have a theory." "Tell me." There was a fourth regulatory official. Peripheral involvement, not named in the indictments, not caught in the net. Someone who knew enough to know there was a connection between me and the case and you, and enough to want to destabilize it. A pause. It may have been a last move, a test of whether the relationship was a weak point. "Is it?" "I thought so initially. I thought involving anyone in my personal life was a structural vulnerability." He looked at her steadily. "I was wrong about that." "How so?" "Because a vulnerability is a thing that makes you weaker. You've made me." He stopped, searched, found the word, steadier. "The case moved differently once you were in it, not because of the Thomasine connection that came later, because I was thinking more clearly, making better decisions. A beat, that's not a vulnerability." Zuri was quiet for a moment. That's a very Caspian Voss way of saying something. "It's the accurate way." "The accurate way," she repeated. "Then, say the other way." He looked at her. "The non-accurate way," she said. "The one that doesn't involve case architecture." Another of his silences, longer than usual. She let it be. Then, in a voice that was quieter than his professional register and more careful, "The way you are careful with something you've only recently learned you're capable of." "You changed something," he said. "I don't know how to say it more precisely than that. You changed something that I didn't know needed changing, and I would very much like, to not lose that." She looked at him across the table, the letter still between them, the morning light now properly through the window, turning the kitchen gold the way October mornings do when they decide to be generous. She reached across and picked up the letter and folded it in half, set it aside. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay." "We're going to the Ghanaian place this Saturday," she said. "You're going to eat jollof rice for the first time in your life, and I'm going to watch your face when you realize what you've been missing. And then we're going to talk about what honesty actually looks like in practice, which is a longer conversation than Saturday, but Saturday is a start." "Saturday," he said. "And Caspian." "Yes." "The fourth official, the one who sent the letter, are they a threat?" He held her gaze, steady, honest, no protective cushioning. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm working on finding out." She nodded slowly, then work faster. Saturday came with the particular generosity of a late October day that hasn't yet fully committed to winter, the light still warm, the air sharp enough to feel purposeful, the city moving through its weekend rhythms with the loose, unhurried quality that weekdays never allow. They sat at a corner table at Abina's kitchen, which had been in the Rendell district for 11 years and smelled, from the street, of something so complex and welcoming that Caspian had stood outside it for a moment before they went in, just adjusting. The jollof rice arrived in a wide clay bowl, orange-red and steaming, with fried plantain and a piece of chicken that had been marinated long enough to have developed opinions about it. Zuri watched him take the first bite. She watched his face. She had described jollof rice to him once over the phone, in the patient, loving detail of someone for whom food is a complete language, and she had said, "It tastes like a sundae," like someone's grandmother decided that hunger was an insult and fixed it permanently. His expression when he tasted it was the expression of a person who has been told a place is beautiful and has now arrived there and found that the description, however good, was insufficient. "Well," he said. "Don't," she said, "don't say anything yet, just eat." He ate. She ate. Outside the window, Rendell moved through its Saturday. A woman walked past with a child on her shoulders. 2 old men played chess at a table outside the barbershop across the street. A bus went by, nearly empty, catching the afternoon light along its side. "Gwyneth wants to meet you properly," Caspian said, eventually. She said, and I'm quoting, "The woman who brought jollof rice to a reconstruction session at midnight is someone I would like to know." I like Gwyneth's. She likes you considerably. She told me you were the most sensible person involved in the entire operation. She's not wrong. She's categorically not wrong. A pause. Rael also asked if you had any single friends. Zuri looked up. How old is Rael? 26. Priya is 28 and has been described by 3 separate people as a lot in a tone that means they find her magnificent. I'll tell him. They sat in the warm, easy quiet of 2 people who have moved through something difficult and arrived somewhere worth arriving at. Not unmarked, there were still things to resolve, still the question of the 4th official, still the work of building honesty into the structure of something that had begun with a complication. But present, real, the kind of real that holds weight. Can I ask you something? Caspian said. Yes. The letter, when you found it, what was the first thing you felt? She thought about it honestly. Stillness, she said, and then something I don't have a word for exactly. Not betrayal, not yet. More like standing at the edge of something and not knowing yet if it goes down or across. He considered this, and now. She looked at him across the table, at the careful face that was, incrementally and irreversibly, becoming less careful. At the man who had driven across the city at 6 in the morning to sit at her kitchen table and dismantle, voluntarily and without self-protection, the version of events that served him better. Across, she said. 3 weeks after Saturday, the 4th official made a mistake. His name was Farron Chalk, a minor regulatory adjudicator whose involvement in Holloway had been peripheral enough to escape the initial net but significant enough to motivate the letter. He had been, Gwyneth determined through patient and methodical work, the one who had first tipped Pren's people to the existence of the case. Not the architect of its dismantlement that had been someone higher, but the first leak. The hairline crack in the original dam. He had sent the letter believing it would destabilize Caspian through Zuri. What he had not accounted for was that Zuri was not a destabilizing force in Caspian's life. She was, it turned out, the opposite. Chalk made his mistake on a Tuesday, contacting the same journalist who had broken the audit story, apparently believing that feeding her information about Caspian's personal life would redirect the narrative. The journalist, whose name was Odessa Frayne, and who had spent 8 months building what turned out to be the accurate version of the story, called Gwyneth instead. Because Odessa Frayne was that kind of journalist, the kind that had become endangered, who still believed that the story worth telling was the true one. Gwyneth called Caspian. Caspian called the independent oversight body. The independent oversight body, which had been assembled specifically to operate outside the compromised channels that had protected Pren for over a decade, moved with a speed that surprised everyone who had spent years watching the slower machinery of institutional accountability. Farron Chalk was issued a formal notice of investigation on a Thursday morning. Caspian found out at 9 a.m. and did not call Zuri immediately because she was in the middle of a shift. He waited until her lunch break. This was the kind of thing, the waiting, the not calling in the first flash of it that he had been practicing, that she had been teaching him, not with instruction but with example, the way the best teaching always works. She called him first at 12:17. Gwyneth texted me, she said. He could hear the smile in her voice, which was a thing he had discovered he could hear very accurately now, the acoustic signature of her specific happiness. Chalk. Chalk, he confirmed. It's done. Investigation opened. It'll run its course. Yes, it's done. A pause that was warm rather than weighted. How do you feel? He was in his office. The whiteboards had been cleared. Rael had done it the week the indictments came through, in a wordless act of completion that had struck Caspian as the right gesture at the right time. The walls were just walls again, which felt both strange and correct. Like the space is still figuring out what it wants to be, he said. That's okay, she said. Spaces do that. Yes. I have an idea for the space, she said. Tell me. Not now, tonight. Come over and I'll make rice, not jollof, before you say anything. This is a different kind, and I'll tell you about the idea. What kind of rice? The kind that requires me to tell you about my grandmother first. He was quiet for a moment. I want to hear about your grandmother. I know you do, she said, and then because she was Zuri, see you at 8, don't be late. He was not late. He was in fact early, standing at her door at 7:52 with a bottle of something he'd had Declan help him select, and the particular anticipation of a man who is beginning to understand, in the specific and textured and irreversible way that understanding sometimes arrives, that the life he has been building toward was not the case, was not the empire, was not the restitution for a father's legacy or the dismantling of Aldous Pren or any of the large, purposeful architectures he had constructed. It was this ordinary Tuesday evening, this door, this woman on the other side of it who had found him bleeding in an alley and cleaned his wounds without being asked and looked at him like he was a mildly interesting problem, and over the course of 8 months and a kitchen table confrontation and a bowl of jollof rice, had turned out to be the most accurate mirror he had ever stood in front of. The door opened before he knocked. "You're early," she said. "I know." She stepped back to let him in. The apartment was warm with the smell of something cooking, something deep and complex that he didn't have a name for yet, but that already, standing in the doorway, felt like a memory he hadn't made yet. "Leave your coat," she said, heading back to the kitchen. "Come tell me if the heat is right." He left his coat. He followed her into the kitchen. And behind him, the door swung closed on the evening, on the October City and the cleared whiteboards, and the $460 million, and the letter and the alley and all of it, all the complicated origin of everything, and it latched with the quiet, solid sound of something settling into place. Somewhere in the Aldrin district, in an office that had Voss Capital's name on the door and a window that looked out over the city, a phone buzzed once on a desk. A message, unknown number, 2 words. Not finished. The office was empty. No one saw it. What do you think that message means, and who sent it? The story always goes deeper. Drop your theory below, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and tell us which moment in this story hit you hardest. We read every single comment.